Hey there. Tonight we're pulling back the velvet curtains on the most deliciously disastrous scandals of medieval royalty. The kind of stories that would have even the wildest reality. TV producers taking notes. Picture castles echoing with gossip. Kings behaving like unsupervised teenagers at a fraternity party. And royal beds that saw more intrigue than the entire cast of a soap opera. And trust me, by the end of this chapter, I'll share a plot twist so unbelievable, you'll wonder why they don't teach this stuff in school. If you find yourself cracking a smile or learning something new, go ahead and hit like and subscribe, but only if you're genuinely having fun with it. Also, let's make this a global bedtime hangout. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is. Let's see how far this weird history circle stretches. Now, dim those lights, get extra cozy, and let's drift into the world of royal misbehavior, one irreverent story at a time. Let's start with King John of England, a man who could single-handedly turn a formal banquet into a Maury Povich episode. You might know him as John Lackland, trust me. That's not just because he was short on real estate, but because he was the kind of guy you'd never leave alone with your valuables, your wine, or your wife. John's reign, from 1199 to 1215, reads less like a kingly chronicle and more like the original How to Lose Friends and Alienate People, medieval edition. John was infamous for signing the Magna Carta, losing half of France, and somehow managing to offend everyone in between. Politically, he was a walking disaster. Personally, well, let's just say you wouldn't want to invite him to your family reunion. While most kings built alliances through marriage and diplomacy, John preferred the shortcut. Seduce the noblewoman, humiliate the nobleman, then slap everyone with extra taxes as a bonus. Forget traditional warfare. John's main battle tactic was seduction, with a dash of compulsory hospitality. The chroniclers of his day, who usually glossed over things like public executions and witch trials, couldn't ignore John's behavior. They described him as not temperate with women and not abstaining from wives and daughters, which is medieval code for he was the reason everyone double-checked the guest list. At one point, John had a documented 30 mistresses, yes, 30, and that's just the official count. That's not romance. That's an HR violation in the making. There are stories of John kidnapping noblewomen, locking them away in royal castles, and keeping them there until he got bored or needed a new political pawn. It got so bad that barons started refusing royal invitations unless they could lock up their entire households first. Diplomacy, 13th century style. Sure, Your Grace, I'll attend. Just let me chain the doors and hide my daughters under the floorboards. One particularly bold baron wouldn't even meet with John unless he'd secured every member of his family behind closed doors. That's not a meeting. That's a hostage negotiation. And yet, John wandered through life as if he were the medieval equivalent of a heartthrob, convinced that every sideways glance was a swoon. His love letters, full of self-assured nonsense, suggest he saw himself as irresistible. There's absolutely no proof anyone else felt the same way. But when you're king, reality becomes more of a suggestion than a rule. By the time John shuffled off his mortal coil, he left behind a fractured kingdom, a legacy of suspicion, and a rumour mill that probably still echoes in Westminster Abbey. If democracy was invented for any reason, it might just have been to keep King John away from everyone's spouses. Not the worst king in history, but definitely the last person you'd ever ask to babysit your children or your goats. Now, let's sail across the Channel to France for a royal case study in how not to manage stress. Charles VI, better known as Charles the Mad. This isn't one of those ironic nicknames, like calling your tall friend Tiny. Charles earned it fair and square from 1380 to 1422. He started out looking like the hero of a fairy tale, young, handsome, and apparently competent. But then, plot twist, he started forgetting who he was, attacking his own knights, and at one point believed he was made entirely of glass. Imagine being king and insisting your servants wrap you in blankets before you walk through the halls, just in case you shatter. Paranoia? Sure, but at least it was creative. Most kings worried about assassins. Charles worried about being knocked over like a fragile vase at a yard sale. You'd think someone who believed he was made of glass might avoid romantic scandals. But Charles was a multitasker. He managed to juggle a royal mistress, a full-blown delusional episode, and a civil war, all at the same time. His wife, Isabeau of Bavaria, had her hands full trying to run the court, while her husband hid from mirrors and refused to bathe, convinced the water might dissolve him. Forget power couples. This was more like a royal sitcom. Meanwhile, Charles's mistress, Odette de Chamdivers, quietly moved into the palace. She was introduced to courtiers as his comfort, which is medieval for please don't ask questions, just smile and wave. Odette deserves a medal for patience, or at least hazard pay. She brushed his hair, listened to his glass-themed monologues, and helped him layer on enough padding for him to sit down without fear of shattering. Nothing says romance like strapping your lover into a medieval bubble-wrap suit. Charles didn't keep his eccentricities behind closed doors either. He once hosted a wild party called the Bal des Ardents, where he and his buddies dressed up as wild men in costumes made of flammable materials and danced around with torches. If you're thinking, what could possibly go wrong? Well, someone dropped a torch. Several courtiers went up in flames, and Charles barely survived. His dignity, on the other hand, wasn't so lucky. Despite everything, Charles fathered 12 children, some during moments of apparent lucidity, or at least a break in his glass delusions. Historians don't say if he remembered their names, but I'm guessing he avoided anything too fragile sounding. Charles VI ruled France into chaos. But more than that, he managed to blend mental illness, royal scandal, and accidental arson in a way that would make even the most creative reality TV producer jealous. Next up, Peter the Cruel of Castile, who also answered to Pedro the Just, depending on whether you were his friend or on the receiving end of his very personal approach to conflict resolution. Peter ruled Castile from 1350 to 1369, and his idea of romance was an unpredictable mix of passionate love, obsessive jealousy, and, just to keep things spicy, the occasional murder. Peter's early love life wasn't exactly a fairy tale. He fell in love with a noblewoman named Maria de Padilla. He might have married her in secret, emphasis on might, because he was also being married off to other women for political alliances. Enter Blanche of Bourbon, a French noblewoman shipped in for a royal marriage. 3 days after the wedding, Peter locked her up in a castle. She spent the rest of her life in isolation because Peter decided Maria's hair was prettier, Or maybe he just didn't like Blanche's accent. Either way, it's the medieval version of ghosting, but with a lot more castles involved. Maria de Padilla became Peter's lifelong obsession. Even after marrying other women, he kept Maria close. When she died, Peter wept for days, and then, in the kind of power move only a king could pull off, had her declared his legal wife retroactively. That's not just rewriting history. It's turning your entire life into a plot twist. But Peter's definition of passion wasn't limited to impulsive annulments and royal kidnappings. He was known for falling in love with a level of intensity that was less poetic and more dangerous. One of his mistresses, Doña Juana, tried to leave him. She was later found dead, as were several of Peter's political opponents, cousins, or anyone who annoyed him at the wrong moment. Contemporary accounts mention Peter watching executions from his palace balcony, often with a mistress by his side. That's not romantic, that's the villain origin story for every HBO antihero. Even with all this chaos, the Castilian court was never dull. Gossip travelled faster than the wine, and Peter's relationships blurred the lines between passion and vendetta. His idea of a romantic gesture might include a surprise wedding, a shock divorce, or the occasional murder disguised as a family squabble. Eventually, Peter's half-brother decided enough was enough and killed him. A dramatic conclusion to a reign that was basically one long episode of medieval Survivor. If love is a battlefield, Peter was the guy showing up with siege engines. Now, let's pivot back to England for Edward II, who reigned from 1307 to 1327, and is best remembered for two things: losing at Bannockburn to the Scots, and being far more affectionate with his male favourites than with his actual queen. One of those things was considered treason. The other made for awkward dinner parties. Edward's story wouldn't be complete without mentioning Piers Gaveston, childhood friend, rumoured lover, and the man who turned court fashion into a full-contact sport. Piers wasn't just close to Edward. He was showered with titles, gifts, and estates, and he showed up at Edward's coronation wearing enough jewels to rival the crown itself. It was less royal advisor and more medieval hype man. The rest of the nobility didn't appreciate the show. Spoiler alert, they hated him. Edward's wife, Isabella of France, had every right to be furious. She brought political expectations, a hefty dowry, and the reasonable assumption that she wouldn't have to share her husband with his bedazzled best friend. But Edward was nothing if not loyal in the most publicly inappropriate way possible. When the barons demanded Piers be exiled, Edward sulked, sent him away, then brought him right back, like a teenager sneaking their boyfriend through the window after curfew. Eventually, the nobles had enough and executed Piers. Edward went into full-on royal meltdown mode, mourning clothes, public sobbing, the whole tragic show. Did this break Edward of his habits? Of course not. He simply made room for a new favourite, Hugh Despenser the Younger. Hugh didn't just fill Piers's shoes, he kicked down the door and claimed the entire wardrobe. As Edward's advisor, Hugh amassed more land, titles, and power than anyone should legally be allowed to have. The rest of the nobility seethed, and Isabella went from annoyed spouse to vengeance-seeking queen. She found her own lover, teamed up with Edward's enemies, and led an invasion of England. Edward was overthrown, imprisoned, and, depending on which rumor mill you believe, murdered in a particularly creative and not at all family-friendly way. Let's just say medieval revenge was rarely subtle, and sometimes involved things best left to the imagination. Edward II's reign was a master class in how not to mix business and pleasure. It had more drama than a streaming series, and if the Plantagenets had Netflix, his season would have been banned in at least 3 countries. His fatal flaw? Assuming royal privilege meant nobody could touch him. Turns out everyone could, eventually. So, as we close the book on our medieval collection of royal disasters, awkward parties, passionate betrayals, and more scandal than a modern tabloid, get ready, because things are about to get even wilder. Next up, we dive into the world of unhinged monarchs and Renaissance royal scandals, where kings like Wenceslaus of Bohemia prove that ruling is a pretty generous description for what actually went on. Don't drift off just yet. This royal circus is just getting started. Picture this, the late 1300s, Bohemia. Meet Wenceslaus, King of the Romans, King of Bohemia, and, if we're being honest, King of public nudity and regrettable palace after-parties. And in case you're picturing the guy from the Christmas song, Good King Wenceslas, think again. You got the wrong royal. That one was his ancestor. This Wenceslas? Let's just say, no one's writing any carols about his reign, unless there's a verse about wine stains and questionable decision-making. Wenceslas started out looking like he might actually do something with all those shiny titles. He was crowned in his teens, smart, spoke a bunch of languages, seemed capable. But somewhere along the line, he decided the royal treasury was just a fancy word for wine budget. You know how some people treat their fridge like a shrine. Wenceslaus treated the wine cellar like it was his real throne room. Before long, he was running the kingdom with all the sober judgment of your uncle after his 5th round of eggnog. Let's talk about his legendary drinking sessions. I'm not saying his court was a frat house, but if you walked in on one of his council meetings, you'd see more mead than minutes and more limericks than laws. Imagine policy being decided in between drinking songs and the occasional off-color joke. His advisors started showing up with their own flasks, not to join in, but just to survive the negotiations. At Wenceslaus's court, every debate was just a table flip away from turning into a breadstick duel. Forget swords, nothing says. Diplomatic incident, like 2 grown men fencing with carbs. And then there's the nudity. Yes, you heard that right. Wenceslaus took "The Emperor has no clothes" as a personal challenge. He was known for streaking through the castle, sometimes in the middle of official business. One chronicler even claims he would issue royal decrees while wearing nothing but a sword belt. His reasoning? Clothes are for the timid. Hard to argue when the guy issuing tax policy has a crown on his head, a sword at his hip, and nothing else to lose, literally. Romance, if you can call it that, was just as chaotic. Wenceslaus had a thing for barmaids, laundresses, and occasionally a noble's wife. But let's be honest, he seemed more interested in their beer suggestions than their family trees. Affairs at his court weren't scandalous. They were basically an application process. If a noble accused him of seducing his sister, Wenceslaus would just shrug and offer the guy a drink. That's the kind of HR policy that gets you fired in most companies, unless, of course, you're the king. Eventually, the rest of the Holy Roman Empire got tired of Wenceslaus's leadership style. They decided to remove him as King of the Romans, which is medieval speak for, "You're fired, but we're going to pretend it's about politics." Even his own brother called him useless, undressed, and usually unconscious. Yet, somehow, Wenceslaus clung to the Bohemian throne for decades. His subjects tolerated him the way you tolerate that one uncle at weddings, with a lot of eye rolls, strategic seating, and an emergency supply of alcohol. When his reign finally ended, Wenceslaus left Bohemia with a wobbly government, a wine cellar that looked like a disaster zone, and a royal reputation best described as "every day was an open bar, and tomorrow's someone else's problem." That, folks, is what happens when your king thinks statecraft is just another drinking game. Now, let's fast forward to a man who could have really used a lesson in boundaries, Henry VIII of England. Henry ruled from 59 to 1547 and basically turned the monarchy into a one-man reality show, The Real Housewives of Tudor England, except Henry played every part and the heads rolled for real. You probably know the rhyme: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But let's be clear, that's the G-rated version. The full story? It's a royal rom-com that spiraled into a horror series with a side of musical theatre. First up, Catherine of Aragon. 20 years of marriage, no surviving male heir. Henry's solution? Not soul-searching, no. That would be too reasonable. Instead, he went for annulment, a dramatic break with Rome, and invented his own church. Anglicanism exists because Henry wanted to swipe left on his wife. That's not religious reform. That's pettiness with a steeple. Next came Anne Boleyn. Henry wrote her love letters so passionate they could catch fire, and so badly written they could kill a poet. She gave him Elizabeth, who turned out to be one of England's greatest queens, but no sons. Henry's response? Accuse Anne of adultery, witchcraft, and giving the side-eye. The result? Off with her head. Henry moved on with the emotional subtlety of a cement mixer. Then came Jane Seymour. She finally gave him a male heir, Edward, but tragically died from childbirth complications. Henry mourned her so deeply, he waited a whole 11 days before wife-hunting again. Nothing says grief like speed dating for your next queen. Enter Anne of Cleves. Henry picked her based on a flattering portrait. When he met her in person, he claimed she looked like a Flanders mare. That marriage lasted 6 months and ended with what we'd now call a no-fault divorce and a really awkward Yelp review. Catherine Howard was next, young, energetic, and, according to court gossip, about as discreet as a marching band in a library. She was executed for adultery, though, to be fair, being married to Henry at that point meant dealing with a paranoid, gout-ridden king who still imagined he was a Renaissance heartthrob. Then there was Catherine Parr, wife number 6, who survived Henry by being literate, endlessly patient, and an expert at dodging accusations. By the end of his reign, Henry had bankrupted England, eaten enough meat to put a dent in the livestock population, and turned his court into a soap opera where the only thing that lasted longer than the marriages was the body count. Let's be honest. Henry VIII didn't just rule. He put the drama in dynastic succession. And his royal legacy? Still getting the musical treatment centuries later. Now, If you thought kings couldn't multitask, let's talk about Francis I of France, a man who tried to combine ruling a country with starring in his own Renaissance rom-com. Francis reigned from 1550 to 1547 and made being a king look like the world's most glamorous disaster. Francis was the Renaissance in human form, stylish, charming, and about as disciplined as a toddler in a candy store. He loved art, loved architecture, loved Leonardo da Vinci, but above all, Francis loved romance, especially if it involved anyone with a title, a pulse, and a good story for the poets. His court became legendary for two things: outrageous luxury and affairs that made the ambassador's wife blush. Francis basically turned gentlewomen of the bedchamber into the world's first dating app. Political alliances, frequently derailed by romantic entanglements. If you were looking for a stable treaty, you were in the wrong castle. Francis's most famous affair was with Françoise de Foix, a noblewoman with enough wit to roast him in front of the court and survive. She managed to keep his attention for years, but eventually even she was replaced. Next up was Anne de Pisseleu de Hailly, whose name is basically a medieval tongue-twister and whose political influence only grew with every year. Francis managed to keep her on his arm and out of trouble. Francis didn't try to hide his affairs. Quite the opposite, he bragged about them. He once told visiting dignitaries that French kings were expected to be excellent lovers. That sounds noble until you realize he put more effort into his mistresses than his treaties. Even his enemies noticed. The Holy Roman Emperor Charles V once said Francis was more dangerous in the bedroom than on the battlefield. Francis probably took it as a personal compliment and had it embroidered on a pillow. But here's the kicker, somehow. Amid the banquets, the affairs, and the never-ending games of musical chairs with mistresses, Francis actually managed to run the country. Sure, his wars were expensive and his taste in women even more so. But you couldn't accuse him of being boring. His reign was a whirlwind of velvet, scandal, and enough perfume to fumigate Versailles. Francis wasn't just a king. He was France's most seductive historical liability. And honestly, he wouldn't have it any other way. Moving south, let's check in on Alfonso VIII of Castile, who ruled from 1311 to 1350. He was a king with a unique passion, publicly ignoring his wife with Olympic-level dedication. His wife, Maria of Portugal, was noble, well-connected and, unfortunately for her, not named Leonor de Guzman. Leonor was a Castilian noblewoman with a sharp mind, 11 children, and enough political clout to run the court single-handedly. She didn't need a crown. She just needed Alfonso's undivided and very public obsession. Most kings had mistresses. Alfonso made his mistress into a shadow queen. He gave Leonor palaces, lands, and a permanent seat by his side. Meanwhile, Queen Maria sat alone at royal banquets, looking like a sad centerpiece, while Alfonso shot heart eyes at Leonor across the table. Leonor wasn't just arm candy either. She negotiated treaties, commanded respect, and produced more heirs than the official queen. It was practically her full-time job. Alfonso, meanwhile, barely bothered to acknowledge Maria's existence. He only appeared with her for the occasional diplomatic photo op, then sprinted back to Leonor's estate at the speed of marital avoidance. Naturally, this didn't sit well with Maria's dad, the King of Portugal. Things got so tense There was almost a war over Alfonso's very public side romance. Imagine your in-laws being so outraged by your mistress, they start dusting off the swords and calling in the troops. Alfonso didn't care. He just kept parading Leonor around court like a royal trophy. The only thing that finally ended the affair was the Black Death itself. That's right. It took a plague to break up this royal triangle. After Alfonso died, Queen Maria finally got her revenge. She had Leonor thrown in jail and executed, a move historians call vengeful, and most of us would just call long overdue. Alfonso's reign might be remembered for military victories, but really, he was the king of being publicly, unapologetically whipped. And finally, let's visit Philip IV of France, otherwise known as Philip the Fair. Not fair as in just or kind, but fair as in wow, that guy has great cheekbones. Unfortunately, his behavior was nowhere near as pretty as his face. On the surface, Philip was all about piety, moral reform, and being serious. Underneath, he ran his kingdom like a medieval version of The Bachelor, complete with betrayals, secret trials, and a double standard you could see from space. His greatest scandal was the Tour de Nesle affair. It started when his daughter Isabella, yes, the one who would later overthrow Edward II of England, noticed her sisters-in-law spending a little too much time with some knights. And by a little too much, I mean matching gifts and secret tower rendezvous. Isabella tattled to her dad, and Philip launched an investigation with all the subtlety of a wrecking ball. 2 princesses, both married to Philip's sons, were found guilty of adultery and thrown in prison. Their heads were shaved, their titles stripped, and their reputations flattened. The 2 knights involved didn't fare much better. They were tortured and executed in the public square. Because nothing says family values like a medieval public execution. But here's the twist. While Philip was handing out brutal punishments like candy, rumors swirled that he himself kept a few mistresses tucked away in the Louvre. Some said he even had a secret harem of young women for diplomatic purposes. But, of course, no one dared question the king's private life. When you're the guy writing the rules, somehow your sins become statecraft. Philip also had a special knack for weaponizing religion. He went after the Knights Templar for heresy, but everyone knew he just wanted their money. It was the medieval equivalent of robbing your banker and blaming it on divine justice. So, sure, Philip IV looked like a model of royal virtue. But behind the sculpted jawline and the piercing stare was a man whose real specialty was hypocrisy and knowing exactly where all the castle's secret passageways were. And that, my friends, concludes our royal highlight reel of the world's most unhinged monarchs and Renaissance scandals. From naked edicts to royal side pieces and reality show, worthy intrigue, these rulers managed to turn history into the original binge-worthy drama. But don't go anywhere, because up next we're diving into the wild world of Sigismund, Louis XV, and Christian VII, the kings who turned hypocrisy, chaos, and seduction into an art form. And trust me, Sigismund of Luxembourg was the kind of guy who collected crowns like other men collected wine goblets, which, by the way, he also collected. Let's get into it. If you ever thought your family drama was chaotic, just wait until you meet Sigismund of Luxembourg. This guy didn't just stockpile crowns. He hoarded them like a medieval Pokemon trainer on a bender. King of Hungary, King of the Romans, Holy Roman Emperor, you get the idea. If it was shiny, looked good on his head, or came with a title, Sigismund wanted it. And, honestly, if you invited him to your house, you'd be wise to count the silverware and the wine goblets after he left, because he collected those too, with all the enthusiasm of a kid hoarding Halloween candy. Now, let's talk about Sigismund's personal life, which was less royal dignity and more European season finale of The Bachelor. He married Queen Mary of Hungary, a powerhouse in her own right, but married. In this case meant she got a fancy title and a front row seat to Sigismund's ongoing romantic Olympics. Our boy Sigismund had a soft spot for the unconventional. He preferred his relationships with a little less paperwork, a lot more variety, and, ideally, a strict, no awkward morning chats policy. His lovers were an ever-shifting cast of noblewomen, ladies in waiting, and, in a move that proves he was ahead of his time, at least one Italian opera singer before opera was even invented. Talk about being an early adopter. The guy was basically holding auditions for roles that didn't exist yet. Court officials kept losing track of his mistresses, not because there were hundreds hiding behind every tapestry, but because they rotated so fast that some historians suspect the staff just started numbering them, like they were running a deli counter. Now serving mistress number 14. And these weren't your standard issue palace flings. These women had their own chambers, their own servants, and, in at least one awkward twist, a private chapel. Nothing says deep devotion like praying next to your employer's side piece. Was it romantic? Was it completely inappropriate? Yes. Yes, it was. Sigismund also had a thing for costumes. Not for the usual royal mass balls, no. He liked to dress up as a commoner, wander into towns, and see what kind of trouble he could stir up. Sometimes it was for spying, sometimes for a little low-key flirting with the local women, and sometimes just, why not? Now, you'd think people would notice the commoner who strolled into the market square trailed by a dozen servants, all wearing the royal crest, but apparently no one wanted to be the first to say something. Is that our king? No, that's just a very tall merchant with suspiciously good hygiene. But don't let the soap opera distract you. Sigismund was no fool. He ran the empire for decades, launched crusades, hosted the Council of Constance, and pulled off political reforms, all while keeping his love life messier than a royal kitchen after Oktoberfest. One ambassador wrote, Sigismund greets all women as equals, especially in private. Which, on the one hand, sounds pretty progressive for the 1400s, but on the other hand, that's a line that probably got him several HR complaints, if medieval courts had HR. Despite all this, he was genuinely popular. Why? Because he could stand up in public, look regal, and make everyone forget that, behind the scenes, he was running Europe's most chaotic rom-com. He was a one-man renaissance, part statesman, part strategist, part guy your parents warned you about. And somehow, he always got away with it. Now, if you think Sigismund's life was wild, let's fast forward to France and meet Louis the Beloved. Louis the Beloved. And if you're wondering what exactly he was beloved for, it sure wasn't fiscal responsibility. Louis ruled from 1715 to 1774, but ruled is probably too strong a word. He hosted the world's most expensive after-party at Versailles, where government was mostly a rumor, and the only thing being passed around more than royal decrees were silk bed sheets. Louis started out with a lot of promise. Young, handsome, blessed with a solid jawline and a famous last name, his great-grandfather was Sun King Louis XIV, the guy who made Versailles the place to be, if you liked chandeliers, wigs, and never seeing your own reflection in anything less than gold. But somewhere in his 20s, Louis XV decided that boring things like national policy could wait, because he had a never-ending list of ladies in waiting to, well, wait on. Let's talk about the Parc aux Cerfs, which sounds fancy but was really just a low-key, high-security love shack right near Versailles. Louis used it for his, let's call them, private auditions. Girls were recruited, usually poor but pretty, brought in under cover of darkness and rotated through like the world's weirdest seasonal produce. There were so many. The palace guards probably switched to a punch card system. Your 10th visit is free. The most famous of his mistresses, Madame de Pompadour, wasn't just another pretty face. She basically ran France from behind the velvet curtains. When she got bored of the physical relationship, Louis said, "No problem," and promptly built himself a second harem. His logic was simple. Keep Pompadour around for brains and witty banter, and staff the Parc aux Cerfs for, well, everything else. It was organized chaos, France's most unofficial, yet somehow highly efficient internship program. Each girl got gifts, a title, and, when her contract expired, a discreet apartment somewhere in Paris. Say what you will about the monarchy, but HR could never accuse them of not offering severance. And what about Queen Marie Leszczyńska? She was there somewhere, drifting around Versailles like an antique side table. Too expensive to get rid of, too obsolete to use. The minute she stopped producing heirs, Louis treated her like a family heirloom. You're not allowed to throw out, but don't actually want in the living room. The scandal was so baked into court life that no one ever asked if the king had a mistress, just how many this week. Even foreign ambassadors gossiped about the turnover rate in their letters home. Versailles wasn't a palace. It was a brothel with better uniforms and more chandeliers. Ironically, Louis genuinely thought he was a good king. He'd throw a lavish ball, father a kid or three, and then briefly remember he was supposed to be running the country before getting distracted by a new set of silk sheets. His reign wasn't a total disaster, but it did set the stage for his grandson, Louis XVI, to lose his head, possibly because Grandpa spent more time thinking with his little crown than the one on top of his head. By the time Louis XV was finished, France was loaded with debt, the court was disillusioned, and the only people truly happy were the jewelers and silk merchants. Louis left behind a country loved by women, loathed by accountants, and forever haunted by the sound of rustling satin. Now, let's cross the Channel and visit Denmark for a royal drama that makes Versailles look like a monastery. Christian VII of Denmark took the throne in 1766, and calling him king is generous. He was more like a confused mascot who occasionally wore a crown. The poor guy suffered from severe mental illness, likely schizophrenia, and had all the regal discipline of a toddler on a sugar high. He wasn't interested in ruling, unless it involved chasing servants with cutlery, which, by all accounts, was the highlight of his week. Enter Caroline Matilda of Great Britain, his unfortunate wife. She expected a normal royal marriage, or at least one where the king could get through dinner without climbing under the table or miming conversations with his own reflection. Instead, she got a husband who preferred public self-gratification, chatting with his hand and galloping down corridors on imaginary horses while the ministers tried to ignore the commotion. It's unclear what broke first, her patience or his grasp on reality. And then, in waltzes, Johann Friedrich Struensee, the king's physician. Smart, ambitious, and more than a little opportunistic, Struensee quickly became the power behind the throne, and, in a twist straight out of a soap opera, also became the Queen's lover. That's right. Caroline Matilda went from neglected queen to starring in Denmark's messiest love triangle, and the king never even noticed. Struensee wrote the laws, signed the edicts, and kept Christian occupied with puppet shows, sword-fighting games, and gentle reminders to avoid sharp objects. It was the only royal love triangle in European history where one corner was just happily humming to himself in the background. Caroline and Struensee even had a child together, officially the king's, but unofficially, well, everyone at court knew the truth. For a while, the two of them ran Denmark like a progressive, slightly scandalous think tank. But royal courts aren't exactly known for their chill vibes, and soon enough, Christian's mother-in-law got wind of the affair and staged a coup that would make even the most dramatic telenovela writers jealous. Struensee was arrested, tortured, and given a spectacularly dramatic execution, while Caroline was packed off into exile with nothing but her ruined reputation for company. As for Christian, he returned to being a gently supervised liability, spending the rest of his reign in a kind of royal time out, padded with silk cushions and awkward silences. His reign is remembered less for what he accomplished, and more for the pure spectacle of the chaos. A monarch who ruled nothing, a queen who tried her best, and a physician who definitely tried too hard. History calls it a constitutional crisis. I call it Europe's weirdest love story, part political farce, part tragic rom-com, and 100% proof that you can't make this stuff up. And speaking of royal messes, next up we're diving into the wild worlds of Charles II, Eric XIV, and Ferdinand I, a parade of excess, madness, and legacies, so bizarre they make a pirate queen look like a model of restraint. Plus, we'll kick off the legend of the Knights Templar from their not-so-humble origins to crusades, curses, and the birth of a medieval legend. You're not going to want to miss what happens next. Now, let's talk about royal excess, madness, and legacies so macabre you'd think Tim Burton was their family therapist. First up, Charles II of England. Picture this. It's 1660. The monarchy has just been restored after years of Puritan misery. No theatres, no fun. Everyone's wardrobe looks like a funeral home clearance sale. Who rolls into London but Charles, fresh off years of exile, broke, hungry, and determined to turn England into the Vegas Strip of Europe. And, friends, Charles did not come to play. The man struts into power, tosses Puritan rule out the window, and basically invents the royal version of what happens in Whitehall stays in Whitehall. Mistresses? Oh, he collected them like Pokemon. We're talking dozens officially. The unofficial count? Well, let's just say if you ever hear someone in England claim noble descent, there's a non-zero chance Charles is involved. Nelgwyn, now, there's a name. Actress, sharp tongue, and so iconic she branded herself the Protestant mistress just to stand out from the royal crowd. That's right. She basically invented influencer marketing before hashtags were a thing. Then there's Barbara Palmer, who was less a mistress and more of a permanent royal roommate. She had her own wing, her own children by Charles, each of whom was generously given titles and land, because in this family, nepotism truly is a sport, and she even received a government pension on top of it all. It was less secret lover and more HR-approved workplace relationship. Charles was not subtle. He paraded his mistresses at court, paid them out of the treasury, and just to save everyone time, built a corridor at Whitehall so they could slip into his bedroom without having to schmooze with foreign ambassadors first. Talk about streamlining your workflow. Meanwhile, his actual wife, Queen Catherine of Braganza, played the role of dignified sufferer. She had no children, and Charles, in a moment of what he probably thought was charm, told people she could not bear children, but she never gave me trouble. That's the kind of compliment that comes with an asterisk and a marriage counselor's business card. Charles, on the other hand, fathered at least 14 illegitimate kids, most of whom he acknowledged and showered with titles, birthday parties, and, let's be honest, an awkward family Christmas card. Now, you'd think the British public would be scandalized. But, honestly, they were just thrilled to have the theatres open again. Charles turned the monarchy into an ongoing masquerade ball, complete with wigs, scandal, and more eyeliner than a 2000s emo band. His popularity soared. After years of Puritan no-fun policies, the people were ready to forgive anything as long as someone brought back the party. And when Charles finally died, his famous last words weren't about the state or even his family. No, he went out with, "Let not poor Nelly starve." Not, "God bless England." Not, "Rule wisely, my brother." Just a final shout-out to his favorite mistress. If ruling a country was like hosting The Bachelor, Charles II would have handed out the final rose to every contestant and then crashed the after-party. But let's take a sharp left into the icy north, because Sweden's history said, "Hold my mead." Meet Eric XIV, King of Sweden from 1560 to 1568, a man who started off looking like a Renaissance heartthrob and ended up as the poster boy for how not to run a monarchy or a dating app. At first, Eric seemed promising, tall, handsome, interested in astronomy and the arts. He's the kind of king who'd write you a love sonnet and then explain retrograde motion over a candlelit dinner. Unfortunately, he was also obsessed with astrology and never made a single decision without consulting the stars. And those stars, they never once told him to calm down. Eric's romantic life was, let's call it, ambitious. He shot for the moon, literally, by proposing to Queen Elizabeth I of England. Several times. She declined, gently at first, then with increasing levels of, "Please lose my number." Eric didn't get the hint and sent her portraits of himself, 16th century sliding into the DMs with a shirtless selfie attached to a marriage contract. When Elizabeth put him on permanent read, Eric pivoted hard. He fell in love with Corinne Monsdotter, a commoner and the daughter of a jailer. This sent Swedish nobles into a collective panic attack, which only made Eric more determined. He married Karin, made her queen, and immediately spiraled into a year of paranoia, locking up nobles and stabbing anyone who looked at Karin sideways. And then, the pièce de résistance, the Stur murders. Eric invites a bunch of nobles to dinner, which is royal code for "this will not end well." Sure enough, mid-meal, Eric grabs a knife and personally kills a nobleman, all while shouting things that made his courtiers wonder if the stars had finally overcooked his brain. From there, it's a rapid descent. He starts hearing voices, hiding from invisible enemies, and occasionally dressing in disguise to spy on his own council, Sweden's first method actor, apparently. The nobility, tired of the murder mystery dinner parties, staged a very Swedish intervention. They locked Eric in a castle and handed the crown to his brother. Eric spent the rest of his days imprisoned, writing weird poetry to Karin and ranting about conspiracies. Moral of the story? Never trust the king who writes his own horoscopes, and always check for hidden daggers at royal banquets. Sweden walked away with a few lessons. Don't hire starry-eyed romantics as kings, and always keep a therapist on speed dial. Eric's legacy: paranoia, poetry, and a cautionary tale about the dangers of mixing romance with absolute power. Now, if you thought that was dark, buckle up for Ferdinand I of Naples, also known as Ferdinand of Aragon, because this guy took intimidation tactics to a whole new, taxidermy-filled level. Ferdinand ruled Naples in the mid-15th century and had all the usual kingly talents, crushing rebellions, balancing budgets, and keeping the nobility in check. On the surface, he seemed like that rare blend of cultured and ruthless, a king who could recite poetry and then order your execution without missing a beat. But Ferdinand's real hobby, let's just say, dinner at his place, was strictly eat before you visit. Most kings would exile traitors or toss them in the dungeon. Not Ferdinand. He had a taste for taxidermy, and not the animal kind. After executing rebellious nobles, he had them embalmed and artfully displayed in a private museum beneath his castle. Welcome to the Black Room, part haunted house, part political warning label. He'd give guided tours to foreign dignitaries, ambassadors, even potential traitors. Here's Count so-and-so, caught plotting treason. Notice the expression, mid-scream. Very lifelike. Some guests fainted. Ferdinand found it hilarious. If you think your Airbnb host's weird doll collection is unsettling, try a basement full of preserved politicians. And while Ferdinand was curating his human trophy room, his love life was equally complicated. He fathered children all over the kingdom, handing out titles like party favors. His official queen was just one option in a crowded field, and Ferdinand treated marriage vows like a suggestion, not a rule. Mistresses spanned all social classes, and discretion was nowhere to be found. Banquets often doubled as flirtation contests. A visiting ambassador once remarked that Ferdinand never sat down to eat without sampling several types of company, both political and personal. Despite all this, Ferdinand was genuinely popular. The people admired his strength. And the nobles, well, after a quick trip through the Black Room, their rebellious urges tended to evaporate. Ferdinand ruled for decades, died peacefully in bed, and passed his kingdom on to his somewhat legitimate heirs. His legacy? A stable kingdom, a terrifying basement, and a crystal-clear message. Some kings build alliances, others collect warning signs in glass cases. All right, enough with the royal family drama. Let's switch gears to the rise of the Knights Templar, because nothing says history just got weird. Like 9 knights, a vow of poverty, and a dream of becoming the avengers of the Holy Land. The year is 1119. Jerusalem is still smoldering from the First Crusade. Christian pilgrims are pouring into the city, convinced it's finally safe, but outside the walls, it's a medieval version of Grand Theft Auto. Bandits, raiding parties, and the occasional warlord make travel about as safe as late-night public transport. Enter Hugues de Payens and 8 of his closest friends. These aren't just knights, they're monks with swords and a serious commitment to living on a budget. No wives, no gold, no land, just horses, chainmail, and a willingness to die for strangers on the road. They call themselves the Poor Fellow, soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon. It's not catchy, but hey, branding was still in beta. King Baldwin II, always on the hunt for a good PR move, gives them quarters on the Temple Mount. So, from the ruins of Solomon's Temple, they take their name, the Knights Templar. For 9 years, they operate on a shoestring budget. They train like maniacs, borrow armor, and share horses. Picture the world's most intense, poorly funded CrossFit gym. But soon, their monk-warrior hybrid routine catches the eye of Bernard of Clairvaux, who is basically the spiritual influencer of his era. Popes listen when Bernard talks, and Bernard sees something holy in these dusty knights. At the Council of Troyes in 1129, he helps draft their official rule, a monastic code with a dash of martial law. The Templars now have a mission, a brand, and the Pope's official stamp of approval. Suddenly, donations start pouring in. Young nobles abandon their Netflix subscriptions, well, their equivalent, and flock to join this elite squad of holy warriors. With papal recognition, the Knights Templar aren't just a band of misfits anymore. They're a religious order with divine backing and a killer uniform, white mantles, blood-red crosses, and an attitude that says, "We take brunch very seriously." The Templars are now the shock troops of Christendom. The Crusader states, those precarious Christian outposts in the Middle East, are always one bad day away from collapse. But the Templars become the wall that holds back the tide. Their code is simple: never retreat unless outnumbered 3 to 1. No ransom, no mercy, no fear. They train daily, fight with fanatical discipline, and believe dying in battle is top-tier career advancement. Most knights fight for loot or family pride. The Templars fight with the conviction of people who think heaven is literally one good sword swing away. To the Muslim commanders, they're easy to spot: white mantles, red crosses, and a reputation for never backing down. Battle reports start mentioning them by name, those white-cloaked devils again. But they don't just fight, they build. The Templars construct a web of castles and outposts across the Holy Land, like a medieval Starbucks franchise. Safed, Bagras, and more, no frills, all fortress. Thick walls, secret tunnels, booby-trapped gates, and water systems designed to outlast the worst sieges. When other armies run, Templars stay behind to buy time, or die trying. And here's the twist. Their loyalty isn't to any king or emperor. It's to the Pope, and only the Pope. No king can order them. No baron can bribe them. Only their Grand Master, elected from within, gives the orders. They're legally untouchable, spiritually untouchable, and just this side of terrifying. Secret ceremonies, strict discipline, a code of silence. These guys are building a legend as much as an army. People start whispering about their rituals. Are they saints or something darker? Either way, everyone wants in. The Templars go from 9 dusty nights to a continent, spanning elite order. But with great fame comes great jealousy, and the shadow of envy starts to creep in. The sword of God is sharp, but sooner or later, someone's going to turn it on the Templars themselves. Now, speaking of turning points, what happens when holy warriors trade swords for ledgers and castles for counting houses? Stick around, because next, we're diving into the wild story of how the Templars went from battlefield legends to the world's most feared bankers. Picture this, a band of scrappy knights, starting out with whatever battered armor they could beg, borrow, or, let's be honest, borrow, with no intention of returning. Their only real currency at the beginning was a vow of poverty and a whole lot of nerve. Fast forward 100 years, and these guys aren't just swinging swords in the desert. They've somehow become the medieval equivalent of Wall Street, minus the suits, plus the chainmail. Now, here's the twist. The Knights Templar didn't wake up one morning and say, "You know what? Let's open a bank." No, war handed them riches, faith handed them trust and necessity. Well, necessity forced them to get creative. The donations started rolling in from nobles desperate to buy a little salvation. We're talking land, livestock, gold, and even entire villages. Imagine a billionaire today just tossing you a small country because they like your vibe. That's what the Templars were working with. But they didn't just hoard this windfall like medieval dragons. No, the Templars ran their operation like a Fortune 500 company. They built commanderies dotted across Europe. Think of them as a mix between a monastery, a fortress, and your local bank branch. Every field, every sheep, every sack of grain was counted, taxed, and recorded. Absolutely nothing slipped through the cracks. And here's where it gets wild. A monk freezing his toes off in England could send funds to the front lines in Jerusalem, and it'd arrive within weeks. That kind of logistical superpower was unheard of in the 12th century. But the Templars didn't stop with real estate and farm animals. They accidentally invented international banking. If you were a nobleman heading off to the Holy Land, instead of stuffing your armor with coins and hoping no one noticed your suspiciously jingly walk, you'd just drop your cash off with the Templars in Paris. They'd hand you a coded letter, basically a medieval debit card, and you'd pick up your money in acre. All for a modest fee, of course. You know, just enough to keep the holy lights on. People started to notice. Kings, queens, bishops, merchants, everyone trusted the Templars. They never defaulted, and their records were so precise, you could practically hear the abacus clicking from miles away. They became the Swiss banks of their age, centuries before Switzerland even had time to perfect fondue. Need someone to guard the French crown jewels. Call the Templars. Need to manage the Pope's money. Templars again. Need a loan to invade your neighbor? Guess who's writing the check? At one point, they even lent money to the kings who'd later stabbed them in the back. Ironic, right? But here's the kicker. The Templars didn't exactly flaunt their wealth. They weren't strutting around, decked out in silk and gold chains. Their churches were plain, their outfits so humble, you'd think they were auditioning for Who Wore It Beige. But underneath all that piety and plainness was an empire, an invisible network of ledgers, vaults, and armored wagons crisscrossing Europe. The Templars had their hands in almost every economy, a silent power you couldn't see but definitely felt. And still they insisted, we're not bankers, we're monks. Everything we do is for God. Sure, and the local bishop just happens to like counting gold for fun. But with all that gold flowing through their fingers, enemies started circling. The church mostly let it slide. After all, the Templars only answered to the Pope. And if you're on the Pope's speed dial, you're probably not too worried about the neighborhood gossip. But kings, oh kings, were sweating. They owed the Templars a fortune, and there was nothing they could do to control them. Somewhere along the way, the Templars' original mission, defend pilgrims, protect the Holy Land, started to blur. Now they were warriors with no battlefield, monks without a monastery, bankers without a country. The weight of suspicion grew heavier. Power with no oversight. That's when rulers start getting twitchy. You know the drill. When you owe someone money and can't pay it back, you either find a new lender or, you guessed it, sharpen your knives. But while the Templars' vaults got heavier, their job got harder. The Crusader states, those fragile outposts clinging to the edge of the Middle East, were falling apart. They were castles made of sand, and the tide was coming in fast. At the head of that tide was Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. And honestly, the Crusader lords looked like toddlers squabbling over a sandbox compared to him. Saladin had one goal: take back Jerusalem. And in 1187, at the Battle of Hattin, he did exactly that. The Templars were there, of course. They fought to the last man, but there was no divine intervention, just scorching heat and a brilliant enemy. The entire Christian army was crushed. Hundreds of knights were captured. Most were ransomed, but the Templars, Saladin saw them as too dangerous to keep alive. He executed nearly every last one. Losing Jerusalem wasn't just about territory. It was a spiritual gut punch. The city they'd sworn to defend, the heart of their whole reason for existing, was gone. The holy relics were back in Muslim hands, and the Templars' purpose started to unravel. But they didn't just crawl away. They regrouped, joined the Third Crusade, and even had the legendary Richard the Lionheart on their side. He trusted them on the battlefield, but even Richard couldn't claw back Jerusalem. Over the next 100 years, the Crusader states withered away. One by one, the cities fell. Antioch, Tripoli, and finally Acre in 1291. That was it, the last Templar stronghold in the Holy Land, gone. They retreated to Cyprus, built themselves a new headquarters, and desperately tried to matter in a world that was moving on without them. But something fundamental had shifted. They were still warriors, but now there were no holy sites left to defend. What were they even fighting for? Their castles stood empty, their stories gathered dust, and their famous discipline started to slip. Meanwhile, rival orders like the Hospitallers stepped into the spotlight. Accusations of pride, corruption, and arrogance followed the Templars everywhere. Whispers spread that they'd grown too rich, too secretive, maybe even too heretical for their own good. Some said they were hoarding relics, dangerous ones. The East had made them, shaped them, and finally broken them. Now, stripped of their original purpose, the Templars were adrift. They still had their gold, their networks, their intimidating reputation. But the core of what made them matter, that holy crusade, was gone. They'd become a sword with no war to fight, a brotherhood with no crusade to lead. And in that vacuum, powerful enemies were watching. By the dawn of the 14th century, the Templars still had it all: riches, fear, and a reputation that echoed through Europe. But as you'll see in the next chapter, all that power just painted a giant target on their backs. Betrayal, destruction, and the birth of the Templar myth are coming next. And trust me, you won't want to miss the fireworks. So, picture this. It's the early 1300s. The Knights Templar, those legendary warrior monks, have it all: wealth, influence, and a reputation that terrifies anyone who ever thought about skipping a tithe. But here's the twist. Suddenly, nobody needs them anymore. The Holy Land is out of the picture. The Crusades are cancelled, and now the Templars are basically a medieval Fortune 500 company with no customers. Imagine a group of ex-Navy SEALs running a global bank, but now there's no war, no holy purpose, and they're still raking in interest. And the kings? Oh, the kings are fuming. Enter King Philip IV of France, also known as Philip the Fair. But let's be clear, fair here means blonde hair and a pretty face, not fairness and justice. This guy is about as fair as a rigged dice game in a back alley. He's bankrupt, drowning in debt from his constant wars with England and Flanders, and guess who he owes? That's right, the Templars. The king's IOUs are piling up in the Templar vaults, and he hates every single one of them. But Philip isn't just annoyed about the debt. He's looking at the Templars and seeing a rival government right inside his own borders. They've got land all over France, fortresses that are more secure than his palaces, their own courts, and an army that answers to nobody but the Pope. And worst of all, these monks don't pay a single coin in taxes to the king. They're basically medieval Switzerland, but with more swords and less chocolate. So, what does Philip do? He doesn't try to pay back the money. No, that would be too easy. Instead, he starts plotting. He fires up the royal rumor mill, and suddenly everyone's whispering that the Templars are up to all sorts of heretical nonsense. People start saying they worship idols, spit on the cross, and, my personal favorite, indulge in secret, obscene initiation rituals. There's no proof, but let's be real. When has that ever stopped a good witch hunt? And if there's one thing medieval Europe loves more than bread and plague, it's a juicy scandal. Philip leans hard on his hand, picked Pope Clement V to launch an investigation. Clement drags his feet. He's nervous, maybe a little too cozy with the Templars, but Philip isn't waiting around for papal approval. He's got a plan. And this is where things go full Netflix thriller. Philip organizes one of the most synchronized, cold-blooded crackdowns in all of weird history. He picks a date, lines up his soldiers and his torture squad, and sets the trap. The big day? Friday, October 13th, 3007. Yes, that Friday the 13th. That's right. If you avoid black cats and ladders on Fridays, you can thank King Philip for making that date infamous. Before the sun is up, soldiers are fanning out across France. Their orders? Grab every Templar you can get your hands on. No warnings, no resistance, no time to even grab your holy socks. Knights are ripped out of bed, some still in their armor, others still muttering morning prayers. In Paris, Grandmaster Jacques de Molay is arrested, betrayed by the very nation whose crown jewels he once protected. I mean, talk about no good deed goes unpunished. Everywhere, Templar strongholds are stormed, chests are pried open, libraries are seized, and the king's men are probably hoping for gold, but mostly finding endless paperwork and the medieval equivalent of how to run a bank for dummies. The accusations are completely wild. Heresy, devil worship, spitting on crosses, secret ceremonies so bizarre even HBO wouldn't touch them. Most of these charges are invented by Philip's lawyers after a little too much communion wine. But here's the thing. In an age where superstition is currency and everyone's terrified of damnation, who needs evidence? The whisper campaign is enough. And the moment the first Templar confesses, after questioning involving racks, flames, and a lot of screaming, public opinion turns. Suddenly, the people who once cheered the Templars now cross the street to avoid them. The Pope, meanwhile, is humiliated. He tries to step in, but Philip's already in the driver's seat. Other countries, like England and Spain, look at France and say, maybe not. In some places, Templars are released. The charge is waved away as nonsense. But in France, the machine of condemnation just keeps grinding. And torture? It becomes the order of the day. Dungeons across France are filled with the sound of men being stretched, burned, and shredded until they'll say whatever the inquisitors want. Did you worship a severed head called Baphomet? Sure. Did you deny Christ? Absolutely. Did you hold secret ceremonies where you kissed each other on the lips? Why not add that to the list? Under that kind of agony, truth isn't even in the room anymore. Even Grandmaster de Molay confesses, then later recants. But it's too late. The show must go on. Philip's not just destroying his creditors, he's making an example out of them. This is a masterclass in medieval PR. Destroy the enemy, then tell everyone they were monsters the whole time. By 1312, it's all over, but the crying. Under relentless pressure from Philip, the Pope finally dissolves the Templar order at the Council of Vienne. The official decree comes down, the Templars are done. Their lands are handed over to the Knights Hospitaller. But let's be honest, not all of it makes it there. A lot of gold and valuables disappear. Some say the Templars hid their treasures. Others claim Philip's cronies just looted everything worth taking. And then there are those who say the real treasure wasn't gold at all, but secrets, knowledge, relics, maybe even the Holy Grail itself. It's the historical equivalent of the real prize is the friends we made along the way, but with more beheadings. But the final tragic act is still to come. In 1314, after nearly a decade in prison, Jacques de Molay is dragged out in Paris to face execution. He's not alone. Geoffroy de Charny, another senior Templar, is with him. Both men have recanted their confessions, insisting the order was innocent, and for that they're going to burn. They're tied to stakes on a small island in the Seine, and as the fire climbs, de Molay shouts out through the smoke, calling on God to judge those who condemned him. And here's where legend and poetic justice collide in true Friday the 13th style. According to the stories, de Molay curses both Philip and Pope Clement, telling them they'll meet their maker within a year. And, plot twist, they do. Clement is dead within a month. Philip follows before the year is out, dropping dead without warning. Coincidence? Divine retribution? Or just the medieval equivalent of don't mess with the guy who knows all your secrets? You decide. With the last Grand Master burned and the order shattered, you'd think the Templars would vanish from history, right? But no. This is where things get deliciously weird. The Templars don't fade. They go full myth mode. Suddenly, everyone's obsessed with what happened to their treasure. Did they sneak the Holy Grail out of Paris? Did they hide the Ark of the Covenant under some dusty castle? Did they guard the bloodline of Jesus himself? There's no evidence, but when did that ever stop a good conspiracy theory? The story only grows. Some say the surviving Templars went underground, blending into other monastic orders or becoming mercenaries. Others claim they formed secret societies, keeping their rituals and relics alive in the shadows, biding their time for a comeback. Over the centuries, these whispers mutate and snowball. Now we've got Templars showing up everywhere, supposedly founding Freemasonry, masterminding revolutions, even building cathedrals. If you believe some folks, they're basically the Illuminati with better branding. Pop culture eats this up. The Templars appear in everything from Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code to Assassin's Creed, morphing from disgraced monks to globe-spanning puppet masters. Sometimes they're the good guys, sometimes the villains, but always mysterious, always powerful. The more people retell the story, the bigger and wilder it gets, until the line between fact and legend is so blurry, you need a Templar map just to find it. But let's drag this myth back to reality for a second. The real Templars were flesh and blood men. They were brave, certainly, but also flawed, religious warriors caught between sacred vows and the dirty business of medieval politics. They tried to serve God and bank like Wall Street, and in the end, it was their power and independence that doomed them. Yet, the legend endures, because history loves a good mystery, especially one with curses, treasure, and secret societies. And don't forget what they actually accomplished. The Templars weren't just knights, they were innovators. In a world where kings ruled by divine right and banking was basically considered a sin, The Templars built a network of finance, logistics, and diplomacy that stretched across Europe. Their letters of credit, basically the world's first checks, let pilgrims and nobles move money safely across borders. Their commanderies ran like the regional branches of a multinational corporation, only with more chainmail and fewer PowerPoint slides. If you want to talk about globalization, the Templars were already running the beta version. They also changed knighthood. Before the Templars, chivalry was an idea, something you might talk about while knocking a goblet of wine off the table. The Templars institutionalized it, turning discipline and unity into a fighting force that prefigured modern special ops. These weren't lone wolves jousting for love and glory. They were units, drilled to fight and die for a cause, even when that cause dissolved beneath them. And when it all came crashing down, their fall became a cautionary tale. The Templars became the symbol of unchecked power, answerable to no one, richer than kings, protected by the Pope. Their destruction exposed just how fragile even the mightiest institution can be. It was medieval corporate warfare at its finest, except instead of hostile takeovers, you got dungeons and burning stakes. Today, the Templars are more myth than man, but that myth still shapes our memory. Their red cross lingers in stone carvings, in stained glass, and in every conspiracy theory that needs a shadowy cabal pulling the strings. We remember them as warriors, visionaries, traitors, and victims all at once. Their story reminds us that history isn't just about who won the battles, but about who got roasted, literally and figuratively, along the way. So, next time you see that red cross on white cloth, remember, it was worn by men who thought they were doing God's work, until politics, ambition, and a king with a big debt and a bigger grudge decided otherwise. In that clash of steel, gold, and fire, the Knights Templar became immortal, not in flesh, but in legend. And as long as there are stories to tell, their ghost will always ride. Now, speaking of legends that outlast their creators, let's set our sights on Paris. In the 12th century, the world was changing, and with it, a new vision was about to rise from stone, ambition, and faith. Notre Dame was about to be born. Picture Paris in the 1100s, a city on the move, but still smelling a little too much like horse and medieval ambition. The markets are buzzing. Scholars in long robes are arguing about the finer points of Aristotle while dodging chamber pots, and the church is flexing harder than a bodybuilder at Venice Beach. It's not just a city, it's a powder keg of big ideas. And right in the middle of all that chaos, one man is about to drop the medieval equivalent of the mic, Maurice de Sully. Now, this guy isn't your run-of-the-mill bishop. Maurice de Sully is a man with a vision, and not just any vision. He's not sitting around thinking, how do I make Sunday service less boring? He's dreaming of a cathedral that makes every other building in Paris look like a sad, crumbling gingerbread house. The old cathedral, St. Stephen's, was falling apart, and if you blinked, you might miss it. Paris was exploding in every direction, and its spiritual heart looked like it missed the memo. So, Maurice grabs the bull by the horns and says, let's build something so colossal, so jaw-droppingly gorgeous, that even the angels will want to move in. He's pitching a cathedral, not just for worship, but as a monument to the Virgin Mary and a full-on flex of French Catholic power. We're not talking about another chunky fortress-like Romanesque church with barely enough windows to see your own feet. No, Sully wants to go where no man has gone before. Welcome to the age of Gothic. Higher ceilings, thinner walls, and enough drama to make any reality show jealous. And then, in 1163, the dream leaves the drawing board and hits the ground, literally. Tradition says Pope Alexander III himself shows up to lay the first stone. Picture the fanfare, incense chanting, robes swishing, and a crowd craning their necks to see this holy construction kick off. They start at the East End, building the choir and the apse, the spot where, one day, choirs will belt out hymns so powerful they'll rattle your soul. But let's not kid ourselves. This is no weekend DIY project. Notre Dame isn't just a building. It's a generational marathon. Cue the people of Paris. Stonemasons working with nothing but muscle. Blacksmiths hammering out tools. Carpenters raising scaffolding that looks like it was designed by someone with a fear of heights, and artists chiseling saints into blocks of limestone. Every single stone is hauled from the quarries, dragged by hand or oxen, then shaped, carved, and hoisted up, one back-breaking inch at a time. There's no crane, no shortcuts, just sweat, stubborn resolve, and a whole lot of, well, maybe my grandkids will see the roof finished. It's the ultimate group project. Fathers teach sons how to carve, sons teach their sons, and so on. Each generation passing down chisels with hands still calloused from the last round. Decades pass. Paris keeps growing, and Notre Dame keeps inching skyward. For most of these workers, their names will never make it into the history books. No statues, no plaques, just the quiet reward of faith and the knowledge that they're building for something bigger than themselves. But Bishop Sully isn't losing sight of the prize. He wants a house of God so spectacular that just stepping inside makes you want to check your shoes for holiness. Notre Dame isn't meant to be just another church. It's an act of devotion chiseled into stone, a challenge to every other city in Europe. Come at me, bro. That first stone is just the opening act. What follows is going to turn the skyline and the entire continent upside down. By the 1170s, Notre Dame starts to rise. And it's not just another structure, it's a statement. In a city filled with rickety timber houses and streets more mud than cobblestone, this cathedral is a stone sermon, preaching to anyone who can see it. Gothic architecture is still figuring out what it wants to be, and Notre Dame is about to give it an identity crisis. These churches aren't just places to mutter prayers. They're machines built to manufacture ore. The construction moves from the choir at the eastern end, where only the holiest of the holy will get to sing, to the nave, the main hall, for the average Parisian, who maybe skipped a few masses, but still wants to be impressed. Let's talk about the architecture for a second. The walls, thin as they dare, pushing the limits. The ceilings, soaring, ribbed vaults stretching upward like they're reaching for the world's biggest disco ball. Pointed arches aren't just a design choice. They're a physics cheat code, letting the weight slide down instead of crushing everything below. And those ribs in the vault, they're not just holding up the ceiling, they're drawing every eye and every soul up toward heaven. It's the architectural equivalent of a standing ovation. But here's the real twist, the thing that sets Notre Dame apart from every gloomy Romanesque dungeon before it. Light. Unlike the old churches that made you squint just to find the pews, this place is made to glow. Massive stained glass windows let in the sun, transforming it into a kaleidoscope of saints, angels, and biblical drama. With every sunrise, the stories in Scripture don't just get told, they get illuminated, literally. The church isn't just a stage for sermons anymore. It's a light show with a theological twist. Every chunk of Notre Dame is loaded with meaning. The columns, they're not just holding up the roof. They're the saints, standing guard. The arches, more than just decoration, they're gateways to salvation. The stone itself is theology, and the masons are its ghostwriters. Meanwhile, outside, Paris is changing too. The cathedral becomes the city's new heartbeat. Markets spring up in its shadow. The Seine echoes with sermons and gossip. Students from the up-and-coming University of Paris gather nearby, arguing about philosophy and probably procrastinating on their homework. Notre Dame isn't just a building anymore. It's turning into the soul of the city. But let's not sugarcoat it. Building this thing is slow. There's no magic button, no instant cathedral generator, just endless scaffolding, aching muscles, and the occasional curse word muttered under someone's breath. Hundreds of workers grind away, year after year, knowing full well that most of them will never see the finished product. When one drops, another picks up the chisel and carries on, all for a reward that isn't cash or fame, but faith, and the hope that generations yet unborn will stare up at their handiwork in awe. By the turn of the 13th century, the choir and much of the nave are finally standing tall. You can practically see the miracle taking shape. Notre Dame is no longer some wild fantasy. It's stone, glass, sweat, and prayer all fused together. And just like the cathedral itself, the ambitions of its builders keep climbing higher. Because they're about to attempt something so mind-bending, so gravity-defying, it would make even modern architects do a double take. The problem? The higher you build those vaulted ceilings, the more the weight wants to push the walls apart, like a medieval bench press that's about to go horribly wrong. The usual solution, back in the Romanesque days, was to build walls so thick you could lose your horse inside them, and keep the windows tiny, just in case you wanted to feel like you were praying in a crypt. But Notre Dame was meant to breathe, to glow, to reach for the sky both literally and spiritually. And that's when the stone geniuses pull out their trump card, the flying buttress. These aren't just supports, they're stone wings, arching from the upper walls down to massive piers, standing apart like security guards at a nightclub. From the ground, they look ridiculously delicate, like someone tried to knit lace out of limestone. But here's the thing. They work. They take all that outward force from the roof and channel it into the ground, saving the walls from a messy collapse. It's a move so bold, so ahead of its time, it's like showing up to a joust with a Formula One car. The flying buttress changes the whole game. With the pressure off the interior walls, the builders start going wild with windows, big, bold, and beautiful. Suddenly, the idea of a giant rose window bursting with stained glass isn't just a dream, it's on the blueprint. Sunlight explodes into the nave, and now God's stories come alive, not just from the pulpit, but with every colored ray shining through the glass. It's miracle meets engineering with a dash of medieval showmanship. Here's the kicker. The original plans didn't even include flying buttresses. Early Gothic architects were still figuring out what this style could do. But as Notre Dame kept reaching higher, the stress on the walls started to show, and the masons had to think fast, literally building solutions on the fly. So they start adding these stone wings in the early 1200s, turning what could have been a structural disaster into poetry. And, of course, the critics show up. Some folks grumble that the flying buttresses ruin the lines of the building, calling them ugly or unnecessary. But most people stand there, jaws dropped, because Notre Dame now looks like it's being held together by a squadron of stone angels mid-flight. This isn't just a church anymore. It's a living, breathing proof that faith and geometry can get along. It's a hymn carved in limestone, a story told in light and air, and its wings are just beginning to spread. So, as the dust settles and the last rays of sunlight catch those soaring arches, you realize Notre Dame wasn't just a building, it was a revolution. And the best part? The most iconic features, the ones that would make the world stop and stare, were still on the horizon. By the early 1200s, Notre Dame had already transformed the Parisian skyline, but its most legendary elements were just beginning to take shape. And trust me, you're going to want to see what happens next. Builders now turned their attention west, and what started rising there would become the cathedral's signature mugshot. The Twin Towers, and that massive west face you can spot in every Paris postcard, every time someone tries to prove they went somewhere cultural, on vacation. The real heavy hitters, the parts that would make tourists whip out their phones centuries later, were still under construction, and Notre Dame was far from finished showing off. Now, this west facade wasn't just an entryway. It was a flex. You walked up, and the message was clear. Welcome, you insignificant mortal. Prepare to feel tiny. The doors soared skyward, challenging you to even spot the top. And looming above, rows of stone kings, prophets, saints, and demons glared down like the world's oldest security camera system. Entering Notre Dame wasn't just about stepping into a building. It was more like crossing the threshold into cosmic judgment. Wipe your feet, or else. Construction on those famous West Towers kicked off in the early 1200s, and, in classic cathedral fashion, proceeded at the pace of a government line at the DMV. Decades of stacking stone, hoisting blocks, and trying not to drop your hammer on anyone important. The towers crept upward, a slow-motion race to nearly 70 meters tall. But here's the kicker. They were never actually finished as originally planned. No fancy spires poking the clouds, no delicate tips, just two massive flat-topped giants, standing bold and brooding, like twin bouncers at the gates of heaven. Right between the towers, the so-called Gallery of Kings lined up 28 stone monarchs, a whole row of royal lookalikes representing the kings of Judah. Fun fact, during the French Revolution, angry mobs mistook these biblical kings for French ones and gave them all the Marie Antoinette makeover. Heads rolled, literally. But back in the 13th century, these statues sent a message even the illiterate could read: divine right, unbreakable order, the sacred handshake between church and crown. If you wanted to know who was really running the show, this was their front porch. Beneath the kings, 3 enormous portals waited to swallow you whole. The central one, known as the Portal of the Last Judgment, was basically a medieval horror comic carved in stone. Christ sits in glory, flanked by angels, demons, and the freshly resurrected, some heading to paradise, others looking like they just got their report cards and knew they'd flunked. For most folks, these weren't just pretty carvings. This was theology with teeth. Enter with reverence, or else. Eternity starts here, and the bouncers don't take bribes. Above the doors, a rose window exploded into color and light nearly 10 meters across, laced with intricate stone tracery, and guarded by statues of the Virgin Mary and Child. Sunlight poured through colored glass, casting a kaleidoscope of saints and secrets across the nave. Suddenly, you weren't just in a building. You'd stepped into a holy planetarium where every beam of light told a story. By the middle of the 1200s, those towers were practically done. The facade was finished, solemn, symmetrical, and more intimidating than your in-laws on Thanksgiving. Notre Dame stood as a fortress of faith, a billboard for God's authority, and a not-so-subtle warning to anyone contemplating sin. But the builders weren't dusting off their hands just yet. The cathedral might have had a dazzling face, but it was still missing its heart. That meant work now shifted to the inside, the nave, the transepts, the sacred choir, the spaces that would echo with monks chanting, kings stomping, and peasants praying for a miracle. The transepts, those arms of the cathedral's cross-shaped body, became the new focus. Under architects like Jean de Chelles and Pierre de Montreuil, these wings swelled outwards and sprouted their own rose windows, each more jaw-dropping than the last. The north transept window shimmered in cool blues and purples, like the Old Testament frozen in stained glass. The south window burned with fiery reds and golds, blazing the story of the New Testament right into your retinas. These weren't just interior decorating choices. This was theology, in high-def color, light and fire, old and new, 2 wings spelling out the whole salvation saga. Step inside, and the columns soared upward, like the trunks of ancient trees, if your local forest happened to be made entirely of hand-carved stone. The vaulted ceilings, nearly 35 meters above the floor, arched and ribbed like an army of praying hands. It wasn't just architecture. It was a vertical ballet, every line and curve nudging your gaze skyward, toward heaven itself. At the center, the altar waited, the spiritual engine room where Mass was celebrated, relics venerated, and the who's who of medieval France came to kneel. Kings and queens got hitched here. Popes paid visits. Coronations and royal dramas unfolded against a backdrop of incense and candlelight. Notre Dame wasn't just a church. It was the ultimate spiritual stage, the place where France went to strut and kneel, sometimes in the same afternoon. But don't get the idea it belonged only to the rich and powerful. On any given day, the cathedral was packed with every stripe of humanity. Merchants hustling deals, peasants hoping for a little divine intervention, pilgrims journeying in from the sticks, all adding their prayers and voices to the sacred cacophony. The air buzzed with sermons, songs, gossip, and the occasional public shaming from the pulpit. Miracles were rumored, and sometimes even expected. Every square inch of Notre Dame was a story. Sculptures, stained glass, even the worn floor tiles beneath your feet. This wasn't just a place to experience the divine. It was a place that performed it, faith broadcast in stone, incense, and colored light. By the late 1200s, the interior was about as done as medieval construction ever got. The heart of Notre Dame was beating strong. But one thing was still missing. The cathedral needed a crown, something to puncture the sky and announce, yes, we're extra and proud of it. Enter the spire. This wasn't just any spire. Unlike the grounded, heavy-set towers, this one would be pure vertical drama, a needle of oak and lead, rising straight out of the crossing at the center of the cathedral's cruciform. Building it was a technical nightmare and a spiritual dare. Oak beams had to be wrangled skyward by teams of carpenters, using muscle, winches, and the kind of scaffolding that would make a modern safety inspector faint. The spire needed to be light enough not to crush the church below, but sturdy enough to survive every Parisian windstorm the Seine could throw at it. When it was finished, it didn't just scrape the sky, it stabbed it, a defiant exclamation point on the Paris skyline. And while the spire was being raised, the weird party up on the roof began. Gargoyles started emerging from the stone, those wild-eyed, nightmarish creatures that looked like the love children of dragons and your sleep paralysis demon. But these weren't just for show. Many doubled as waterspouts, channeling the rain away from the fragile stonework below. Others were symbolic, stone guardians, keeping evil at bay, or maybe just reminding parishioners what awaited if they skipped confession one too many times. Next came the chimera, hybrid beasts perched high above Paris, their faces frozen in a mix of horror and bemusement, forever on watch. They were equal parts nightmare and marvel. The ultimate Gothic window dressing. Paris got a skyline full of monsters, and honestly, who wouldn't want that? Inside, the final touches were going in. Chapels finished, choir stalls carved, relics tucked into their new homes. Notre Dame was now fully operational, both sacred machine and national stage. It took nearly 2 centuries, tens of thousands of laborers, and the kind of faith that could move mountains, or at least move a truly ridiculous amount of limestone. By 1345, almost 200 years after the first foundation stone was set, the cathedral was officially done. But let's be real, complete is a relative term. Notre Dame was never frozen in time. It kept changing, getting restored, reinvented, and occasionally resurrected after disaster. But as the 14th century dawned, the structure itself was finished. The Gothic age had pulled off its masterpiece, a building with a face, a heart, wings, and finally, a crown. And just like that, Paris would never look the same again. Of course, just because the stones were set didn't mean the story was over. Notre Dame was about to become something much bigger than itself. A living legend, a battleground for kings and rebels, saints and sinners. And as the world changed, so too would the cathedral's legacy, echoing all the way from the medieval heart of Paris to the storm-lashed decks of the South China Sea. By the mid-14th century, Notre-Dame de Paris was no longer just a cathedral. By the 1300s, Notre-Dame de Paris wasn't just another church. It was the Thief's Church. You know how every city has that one building everyone pretends not to care about, but secretly would riot if someone touched it? That was Notre Dame for Paris. Except, instead of overpriced coffee and Instagrammable neon signs, you had Gothic arches, royal crowns, and enough holy relics to make Indiana Jones drool. For 4 centuries, this cathedral didn't just stand still. It loomed right in the middle of everything, like the world's most judgmental grandmother. If you were born royal, wed royal, declared war, or just wanted to flex your power, you did it under those massive, echoing vaults. The kings of France marched in as mere mortals and strutted out as God's chosen, all courtesy of Notre Dame's stamp of approval. The bells? Oh, they didn't ring, they announced. Whether it was a war, a wedding, or a royal tantrum, the sound of Notre Dame's bells could practically be heard telling you, hey, history's happening. Try to keep up. But it wasn't just kings and queens making dramatic entrances. Generals, bishops, and even foreign dignitaries made their way through those massive doors, half in awe, half probably terrified of tripping in front of a stained glass window. And when disaster struck, plague, famine, or some new medieval flavor of apocalypse, Parisians would flood the nave with prayers, hoping divine intervention came faster than a Parisian waiter. Notre Dame became Paris's emotional thermostat. When things were good, it was the city's party planner. When things went south, it was the therapist everyone cried to. Politically, it anchored the French monarchy like a giant Gothic paperweight, plopped right in the middle of the l'Air de la Cité, making every royal event a public spectacle. Priests would bless war banners, reminding everyone that God, apparently, had a season pass to every French conflict. The king wasn't just king, he was spiritually micromanaged by Notre Dame, and culturally, the cathedral was a medieval Las Vegas. Pilgrims would hike across France just to sneak a peek at the crown of thorns said to have once perched on Jesus' head. The organ boomed during feast days. Choirs would fill the air with harmonies that made even the rats pause. And the stone walls soaked up centuries of music, incense, and whispered gossip. Here's the thing about Notre Dame, though. It never sat still. Styles changed. Musical tastes evolved. The cathedral adapted, adding new art, fresh music, and whatever liturgical trend was hot that century. But by the 1600s and 1700s, all that medieval drama started to look a little, well, old-fashioned. The cool kids were into Baroque now, big, bold, and just a little extra. Notre Dame, with its spiky towers and moody vibe, was suddenly considered outdated. Some even tried to modernize it, smoothing out the wild Gothic lines. Imagine trying to give the Mona Lisa a spray tan and some eyebrow threading. Yeah, it was that awkward. Still, Notre Dame stood its ground, stoic as ever, while Paris changed around it. Its towers took a beating from storms. Its bells kept ringing. But under the surface, something was shifting. The world that had made Notre Dame a symbol of power and faith was starting to crack, and there was a new storm on the horizon, one even a cathedral couldn't ignore. Revolution was brewing. When the French Revolution erupted in 1789, Notre Dame suddenly found itself on the wrong team. For centuries, it had been a monument to royalty and religion, which, in revolutionary France, was about as popular as a tax auditor at a street party. The cathedral, once the ultimate flex of kingly power, turned overnight into a target. Revolutionaries stormed in, all fired up to erase the old order. The statues of biblical kings on the facade, oops, mistaken for French monarchs. All 28 of them lost their heads. Sculptures were torn down, altars smashed, and the bells, those massive voices of Parisian history, were hauled down and melted into cannon metal, probably to make some kind of revolutionary statement, only slightly less subtle than a guillotine in the town square. The precious relics, like the legendary crown of thorns, were removed and hidden away, some forever lost. What was left behind wasn't a cathedral anymore. It was a gutted shell, echoing with the ghosts of centuries. In 1793, Notre Dame was officially deconsecrated. Church? Gone. In its place, the so-called Temple of Reason. Because if there's one thing the French Revolution loved, it was rebranding. Suddenly, the grand nave echoed not with hymns, but with the clatter of wine barrels. Yes, at one point Notre Dame became a warehouse for booze. Picture it, the soaring arches, the stained glass, and the lingering aroma of spilled wine and damp stone. The spire, battered and rotting, was deemed a safety hazard and taken down. Gargoyles lost their perches, the roof started leaking, and rats scurried through the crypts like they owned the place. Paris hadn't lost its heart exactly, but it had gained a haunted, hollow ruin right in the middle of its chest. And yet, Notre Dame endured. Because, say what you will about the resilience of stone, sometimes it's stubbornness that saves you. When Napoleon strode into the spotlight, he saw the value in a good backdrop. In 1804, he chose Notre Dame for his self-coronation as emperor, reconsecrating the cathedral just enough to impress the crowds. But don't get sentimental. This was pure theatre. In the most extra move of any royal ceremony, Napoleon grabbed the crown out of the Pope's hands and plopped it on his own head. Notre Dame was back in the limelight, but the sacredness was more stage prop than spiritual. The years passed, and the scars of neglect deepened. By the 1830s, Notre Dame was crumbling, physically and spiritually. Some Parisians thought it would be better to just tear the whole thing down and put up something modern, something less brooding and, frankly, less embarrassing. But then, when the world was ready to swipe left on Notre Dame, a writer showed up to play matchmaker. Victor Hugo, the literary hype man of his age, saw past the cracked stones and bird poop to something timeless. In 1831, he published Notre Dame de Paris. Yep, the book we now call The Hunchback of Notre Dame. This wasn't just a Gothic potboiler. It was a love letter to the cathedral, and a giant guilt trip for anyone who wanted to tear it down. Hugo gave Notre Dame a starring role. Through the eyes of Quasimodo, the misunderstood bell ringer, the cathedral became a living, breathing character, wounded, beautiful, and stubbornly clinging to life. Readers across France had a collective "what have we done" moment. Suddenly, everyone was Team Notre Dame. The building wasn't just old, it was a masterpiece, a monument to centuries of faith, sweat, and, let's be honest, a fair amount of medieval drama. The public outcry worked. By 1844, King Louis-Philippe gave the green light for a massive restoration. Two architects, Eugène Viollet-le-Duc and Jean-Baptiste Lassus, were handed the keys and the mess to resurrect Notre Dame. Their mission wasn't just to fix what had broken, but to restore the cathedral's very soul. They replaced weathered statues, rebuilt the Gallery of Kings, and didn't stop there. The spire, lost during the Revolution, was reborn, taller, fancier, and ready for its close-up. Viollet-le-Duc's new spire soared 96 meters above the ground, instantly claiming its spot as one of the most iconic silhouettes in Europe. Over the 19th and 20th centuries, Notre Dame reclaimed its throne as the spiritual and cultural heart of Paris. It hosted everything from masses to liberation ceremonies, and its doors were thrown open to millions of visitors. Through 2 world wars, the cathedral stood firm. During the Nazi occupation, its bells fell silent, a city holding its breath. But when Paris was freed in 1944, those bells rang out in triumph, reminding everyone that some symbols are too stubborn to die. But if you thought Notre Dame's days of drama were over, think again. On April 15, 2019, disaster struck. Flames broke out beneath the roof, and within minutes, the inferno was devouring the wooden framework known as the forest, some beams dating back to the 1200s. The world watched, some in tears, some in disbelief, as the spire collapsed in a plume of smoke. For hours, it looked like one of humanity's greatest monuments was being erased in real time. But when the fire finally died, the stone towers were still standing. The rose windows had survived. The relics were saved. And, in true Notre Dame fashion, the people of France, and honestly the whole world, came together to rally for the rebuilding effort. Notre Dame isn't just architecture, it's memory, it's identity, it's resilience made stone. Through fire, revolution, neglect or war, it keeps coming back, like a stubborn old friend who refuses to leave the party, no matter how many times you try to turn the lights off. In every stone that rises from the ashes, Notre Dame reminds us that faith and beauty can be reborn, no matter how many times the world tries to write the final chapter. Now, let's switch scenes from the stone jungles of Paris to the humid, chaotic waterways of southern China. Here comes a story that history almost erased, a tale so wild it makes the French Revolution look like a mildly rowdy book club. In 1775, in Guangdong Province, China, a girl was born. No one bothered to write down her real name, because, let's face it, history was too busy chronicling the exploits of men who couldn't even keep their heads attached to their statues. But the world would come to know her as Zheng Yi Sao, the wife of Zheng Yi. What she did with that borrowed name would shake empires and rewrite the rules of the game. Her early years, let's just say they didn't come with a silver spoon. She grew up in the shadowy world of Canton's floating brothels, the infamous flower boats that drifted up and down the Pearl River, catering to merchants, naval officers, and every breed of pirate you could imagine. For most women trapped in that life, the future was as murky as the river water. But Jung Yi-sao wasn't most women. She watched. She listened. She learned which clients ran their mouths after a few drinks, and which ones paid extra for secrets instead of company. Before long, she wasn't just entertainment. She was an information broker. Every whispered deal and drunken boast went into her mental Rolodex. And then came Jung Yi, pirate lord, commander of the infamous Red Flag Fleet, the kind of man who could snap his fingers and make a village disappear. He wasn't the first pirate to cross Jung Yi-sao's path, but he would definitely be the last. Struck by her sharp mind and fearless wit, Jung Yi did what every self-respecting, power-hungry pirate does, he proposed. But Jung Yi-sao didn't just flutter her eyelashes and say yes. She negotiated. In a move so bold it would have made Marie Antoinette blush, she demanded joint control of the fleet, not as a decorative wife, but as a partner. She wanted to shape political alliances, manage the loot, and have a say in every decision. Jung Yi agreed, maybe out of love, maybe because he knew a good strategist when he saw one. Their marriage in 1801 wasn't just a love story. It was the foundation of a pirate dynasty that would make the East India Company look like a lemonade stand. Jung Yi-sao dove headfirst into the world of pirate politics, studying rivalries, hierarchies, and the unspoken rules of the South China Sea. While Jung Yi led raids and made headlines, she worked behind the scenes, recruiting allies, building networks, and learning how to rule from the shadows. But if you think she stayed hidden, think again. Tragedy struck in 1807 when Jung Yi died suddenly, possibly swept away by a typhoon, possibly just a victim of the unpredictable pirate life. The moment the news hit, every pirate captain within 100 miles started sharpening their knives, ready to carve up the Red Flag Fleet. They expected chaos. They expected infighting. What they got instead was Jung Yi-sao, stepping into the power vacuum with the kind of poise that makes other people reconsider their life choices. She didn't take command with brute force or empty threats. She used strategy. She secured the loyalty of the fleet. She married Chung Po-sai, Jung Yi's adopted son and right-hand man, locking in both personal trust and military muscle. In less than a decade, she'd gone from brothel worker to pirate queen, and she was just getting started. If you think that's wild, buckle up. Because when Jung Yi-sao took over in 1807, she didn't just inherit a pirate fleet, she built an empire. And next, we're diving into the pirate code, the rise of her armada, and her all-out war with the Qing dynasty. Let's set the scene. It's 187. And Jung Yi-sao walks onto the deck, not just taking over a pirate fleet, but seizing command of a floating metropolis with more drama than a reality TV reunion. You'd think, after her husband's sudden death, the whole operation would fall apart faster than a cheap sandal in a monsoon. But nope. Jung Yi-sao doesn't just hold it together. She grabs the reins, tightens her grip, and turbocharges the whole pirate enterprise. Under her, the Red Flag Fleet doesn't just limp along, it explodes in size. Forget the image of a handful of scruffy cutthroats drifting around in leaky boats. Jung Yi-sao's armada is the stuff of imperial nightmares. Before she took over, piracy had always been a problem in the South China Sea. But what Jung Yi-sao built was something the world had never seen. She's running an operation so big, it makes the average European navy of the time look like a bunch of guys out for a Sunday paddle. Picture this. She starts with over 300 ships, and within a year, she's doubled that. Some folks claim the numbers eventually reach 1,800 vessels and up to 70,000 crew. Yes, 70,000. The British Navy wishes it had those numbers. The French Navy is crying in a corner. Even the Spanish Armada would be like, "You want us to do what with how many ships?" Mum, that's a bit excessive. But here's what sets Jung Yi-sao apart. She doesn't just rule with an iron fist. She rules with a hoe, Home Depot's worth of iron. She understands pirates, and she knows how to keep them in line. Her secret weapon? Not just brute force, but a system. A code so ruthless and so detailed, it turns her fleet from a pack of wild dogs into a disciplined money-making machine. You mess with her rules, you pay the price. And trust me, the price is never store credit. Let's talk about this infamous pirate code. Forget the Pali. Nonsense from Hollywood. Jung Yi-sao's code is more like the world's harshest employee handbook. First up, stealing from the collective treasury? Congratulations. You just won a free head removal appointment? Assault a female captive without permission? That's not just bad press for your LinkedIn profile. You get executed on the spot. Try to run away? Hope you weren't too attached to your ears, because those are coming off, and you'll get the honor of being paraded in front of your former friends as a walking cautionary tale. But it's not all doom and gloom. She knows you can't run a pirate empire on terror alone. She offers structure, protection, and, most importantly, profit. Her code is actually pretty savvy when it comes to loot. You get to keep 20% of what you bring in, while the rest goes into a communal fund. That's right. It's not just about greed. It's also about creating what is essentially a pirate version of a 401k. And surprisingly, it works. The communal pool pays for ship repairs, pensions for widows, bribes to the right officials, and emergency expenses. In other words, she's running the world's most terrifying HMO. And here's the genius part. This system isn't just about keeping the pirates loyal to her personally. It's about tying everyone's fate to the system itself. If you want to eat, get paid, and not end up floating home in pieces, you follow the code. Even coastal villagers and defeated rivals often decide, you know what? That sounds better than getting torched by these people. So they join up, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of respect, and sometimes because the alternative is dealing with the corrupt local officials. Under Jung Yi-sao, piracy is not only safer, but it's weirdly more fair than life under the actual government. To keep this floating empire from turning into a traffic jam of egos, Jung Yi-sao organizes her navy into 6 squadrons, each with its own color: red, black, white, blue, yellow, and green. Think of it as pirate Hogwarts, but instead of wands, everyone's packing cutlasses and cannons. But no matter what squadron you're in, everyone answers to her. Her right-hand man, Chung Po-tsai, commands the Red Squadron, the Navy's version of the varsity team. And while he's the star player, there's no doubt about who's calling the shots. Now, if you're picturing pirates as a bunch of chaos-loving, rum-chugging frat boys, let's just pop that bubble. Under Jung Yi-sao, this is less Burning Man, more Fortune 500. Her fleet is a floating bureaucracy with taxes, hierarchical promotions, and regular performance reviews, except the performance improvement plan might involve walking the plank. She's turned piracy into a business empire, and the South China Sea is her boardroom. Let's get back to her notorious pirate code. This isn't some romantic scroll with flowing calligraphy. It's a set of laws carved into the collective memory of every crew member, enforced with the subtlety of a sledgehammer. Violate the code, and you're facing consequences that range from public humiliation to instant execution. Want a taste of her HR department? Here you go. After every raid, all loot must be handed over, sorted, and distributed from the central storehouse. The pirate who scored the goods gets their 20%, and the rest props up the collective. Try to skimp. Try to stash a little extra coin in your sock. That's a great way to become a cautionary tale for the next morning's breakfast meeting. Discipline during battle is non-negotiable. Disobey orders or run away, and you're either flogged, tossed overboard, or executed on the spot, depending on the mood and severity. The code even covers relationships. Kidnap a woman, and you'd better treat her with respect. Any kind of assault, and you lose your head, literally. Zhong Yisao isn't interested in chaos. She's interested in order, and her code is the glue holding this pirate superstructure together. What makes her rule so sticky is that it's not just about her personal charisma, though she's got plenty of that. It's the system she's built. She makes sure that every pirate, every coastal town, every new recruit knows the rules, the rewards, and, most importantly, the consequences. Even captured prisoners and civilians are offered a choice: join up and swear loyalty to the code, or face the alternative. Plenty of people take the deal. Some do it for safety, some for profit, and some just because Zhong Yisao's brand of piracy is a better gig than whatever the Qing authorities have on offer. And her empire doesn't stop at the water's edge. Coastal villages under her protection pay tribute, which buys them safety and a bit of autonomy. Those who refuse, well, those towns end up as cautionary smoldering ruins. So the choice is pretty clear. If you play ball, you become part of the empire. If not, you get erased from the map. She's not just a pirate queen. She's practically a shadow monarch, and her word is law. By 1808, what started as a pirate nuisance has turned into a national crisis. The Red Flag Fleet dominates the South China Sea, bullies trade routes, and raids with impunity. The Qing dynasty is officially panicking. They send their navy to deal with the pirate problem. But let's be honest, it's like sending the local swim team to take on Michael Phelps. The Imperial Navy launches campaign after campaign to take her down. But what follows is a masterclass in how not to fight pirates. The Qing get outmaneuvered, outclassed, and, frankly, outsmarted at every turn. Zhong Yisao knows these waters better than anyone. She uses the tides, the weather, and the islands like a chess master. Her crews swap ships mid-battle, lure enemy fleets into traps, and ambush with a level of precision that would make a modern general jealous. Multiple times, entire Qing squadrons get captured and absorbed into her growing navy. It's the world's worst buyout for the Imperial fleet, and the morale gap is enormous. While the Qing officers are busy pocketing bribes and dodging responsibility, Zhong Yisao's people are organized, loyal, and motivated by the code. Victory gets you rewards. cowardice gets you a new career as fish food. As the war drags on, the Qing get desperate. They beg for help from the Portuguese and the British. Now we've got European ships with bigger guns, but they don't know the local waters, and they definitely don't have the fleet cohesion that Zheng Yisao commands. Still, the net tightens. By 1809, a coalition of Qing, Portuguese and Cantonese ships tries to box her in. But even then, she's not cornered. She fights them off, pulls off strategic retreats, and launches bold counterattacks that leave her enemies absolutely stunned. She's not just surviving, she's embarrassing the empire on the world stage. But here's the real talk. Even pirate empires have limits. The war starts draining resources and burning out the men. You can only keep this up for so long before something's got to give. Zheng Yisao knows the score. She's undefeated at sea, but she also knows when to cash out. Sometimes, true power isn't about grinding your enemies into dust. Sometimes, it's about knowing the perfect moment to walk away with everything you've built, intact, untouchable, and legendary. And trust me, Zheng Yisao has no intention of dying on the deck or being dragged in chains before some Qing bureaucrat. She's got an exit plan that's going to leave everyone, friends and enemies alike, completely speechless. By 1810, Zheng Yisao had done the impossible. In our next chapter, we'll dive into how she negotiated her surrender, retired on her own outrageous terms, and ensured her legacy would echo through history long after the last cannon went silent. Let's set the scene. It's 1810, and Zheng Yisao has basically achieved the historical equivalent of beating the final boss on nightmare difficulty, with no cheat codes. The Qing dynasty has thrown everything at her. Foreign navies have tried and failed to knock her off her throne. She's not just ruling the South China Sea. She's doing victory laps around everyone who ever doubted her. But here's the twist. Zheng Yisao isn't one of those cartoon villains who refuses to see when the party's over. She's a pragmatist. She knows when to flip the board and invent a new game. Because, let's be honest, even the fiercest pirate queen can only juggle so many crises at once. Supplies are running thin, alliances are getting a little wobbly, and even her legendary red flag fleet is starting to feel the pinch. So what does she do? Exactly what you'd expect from a woman who's been 3 steps ahead since day one. She pivots. Zheng Yisao doesn't wait for defeat to come knocking. She grabs her pen, sharpens her wits, and decides it's time to negotiate an exit that would make any CEO jealous. Now, picture this. Instead of sneaking away in the dead of night or sending a groveling envoy, she marches straight to the Qing government herself. And she's not showing up hat in hand. No. She sails up to Guangzhou on her own flagship, flanked by bodyguards, with her red flag banners flying so high you'd think she was hosting her own parade. This isn't surrender, it's a statement. She's not there as a criminal desperate for mercy. She's barging in as the head of a maritime superpower ready to set the terms. And she's got a list, a bold one. She demands amnesty for herself and her crew, not just the top brass, but every single pirate who ever swabbed a deck or fired a cannon in her name. We're talking thousands of people here. She insists on keeping her fortune, every ill-gotten coin, every silver ingot, every jewel. Oh, and as a little cherry on top, her right-hand man and husband, Chung Po Tsai. He should be promoted to captain in the Qing Navy. Thank you very much. Imagine walking into a job interview and not only demanding they overlook your entire criminal resume, but also insisting your spouse gets a promotion. The Qing officials, they're stunned. If you listened closely, you could probably hear the imperial jaws hitting the palace floor. But here's the thing. They're just as exhausted as she is. Decades of chasing pirates up and down the coast, bleeding money and reputation, and never quite catching her. The Empire can't stomach another round of this endless, expensive cat and mouse. So, in a rare outbreak of common sense, the Qing government says yes. And it's not some backroom handshake deal. This is spectacle. On April 18, 1810, Zhong Yisao doesn't sneak into town. She leads a procession, 17,000 pirates strong, right into the heart of Guangzhou. Not in chains, not sneaking through alleys. They march in, heads held high, as if they're attending the world's strangest family reunion. Over 200 ships are surrendered in a ceremonial handover. Weapons are laid down with all the drama of a Broadway finale. The infamous Pirate Confederation dissolves, not in a pool of blood, but in a parade. Nobody's hauled off to a dungeon. Nobody's executed. Nobody's fortune is snatched away. Her husband gets his naval commission. Zhong Yisao, she retires, free, untouched, undefeated, and, let's not forget, absolutely loaded. This is not your standard pirate ending. Most pirate stories are like bad breakups, betrayal, violence, a tragic last stand, maybe a lingering ghost or two. But Zhong Yisao, she walks away from the business, pockets full, reputation intact, and not a single drop of blood spilled. She outplayed everyone, first with cannons, then with negotiation. As her iconic red flags come down, you can almost hear the legend beginning to take shape. Let's pause and savor the irony here. Most pirates die in battle or dangle from the gallows. Zhong Yisao's version of walking the plank is just walking away. She doesn't vanish into the night like a fugitive. She strolls into retirement as a respected, wealthy woman whose story isn't over, it's evolving. After the surrender, she sets up shop in Canton, which today is known as Guangzhou, alongside her now officially legitimate husband, Chung Po Tsai. You'd think the leap from pirate queen to upstanding citizen would be whiplash-inducing. But for Zhong Yisao, it's just another calculated move. She lives out in the open, in comfort, and for the most part, the Qing authorities don't bother her. Honestly, they probably just hope she stays bored and out of trouble. But if you thought she was going to spend her golden years knitting or learning to play the guzheng, think again. Zhong Yisao opens a gambling house and, because old habits die hard, runs a little opium smuggling operation on the side. It's technically illegal, but nobody's about to tell her no. Her reputation and connections keep her untouchable. She isn't aiming for another empire, but she definitely isn't fading into the wallpaper either. Her marriage to Chung Po Tsai, her former protégé, now naval officer, isn't just for show. They actually build a life together, raise a family, and become respectable members of society. He heads out to sea, ironically hunting down pirates who are basically his old co-workers, while she manages their business interests and quietly maintains her web of influence up and down the coast. She's still consulted on maritime affairs, still the subject of awe and whispered stories among sailors and merchants from Macau to the Pearl River Delta. What makes this truly wild isn't just that she survived, it's how she survived. Zhong Yisao broke every rule her society had for women. Born into poverty, sold into prostitution, she fought her way to the very top of a man-eat-man world. And then, instead of dying in a hail of musket fire, she retires peacefully and dies of old age. In 1844, at 69, she checks out on her own terms. No redemption arc, no apologies. Just a mic drop. She didn't need forgiveness. Her entire life is a masterclass in not asking for permission. In an era when women were supposed to be invisible, Zhong Yisao commanded fleets, wrote her own codes, and negotiated with emperors. And then she walked away, richer and freer than any pirate who ever terrorized the seas. Her legacy. It's not just a footnote. It's a slap in the face to every expectation, every law, every know your place lecture ever delivered from a dusty old Confucian pulpit. She didn't just inherit power. She built it, expanded it, and made it hers. She forced the Qing dynasty to the bargaining table, then walked away without ever being forced to kneel. Yet, when we talk about pirates, who gets the headlines? Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Henry Morgan, the usual suspects, all men, all meeting violent, dramatic ends. But here's Zhong Yisao, standing quietly in the shadows of their legends, outshining them at every turn. She didn't captain a handful of ships. She controlled fleets. She didn't loot a couple of villages. She ruled entire maritime regions. And she didn't end her days on the end of a rope. She wrote her own ending, with ink and silver. Among the pantheon of pirate legends, Zhong Yisao is the ultimate outlier. Not only the most successful pirate of all time, but also the least understood. Her success wasn't about luck or just raw ruthlessness. It was about brains, strategy, and a terrifying grasp of how to control power. She ruled through fear, yes, but also through a genius for order, reward, and the kind of structure that would make an HR department weep with envy. And let's not forget, she did all of this as a woman in Qing China. Society told her to keep her head down, keep her mouth shut, and stay in her lane. Instead, she rewrote the map, forced emperors to listen, and ended her days as a businesswoman and matriarch. She didn't need to marry into power. She created it, bent it to her will, and then handed it down. So why is she a ghost in most history books? Why do we all know about the Caribbean Boys Club, but not the woman who made empires tremble? Because her story doesn't fit the usual script. She's not a tragic anti-hero. She didn't die in a blaze of glory. She wasn't European. And worst of all for the old-school historians, she was a woman who played the game better than anyone else. Her power didn't just disrupt the story. It broke the machine. In Chinese records, she's a problem solved, not a legend celebrated. The Qing dynasty would rather quietly erase her than admit she exposed their weakness and walked away unpunished. Even in victory, she was an embarrassment they wanted to forget. Western historians, they were no better. For centuries, piracy has been romanticized as a European affair. Peg legs, parrots, a bottle of rum, and a catchy theme song. Jung Yi-sao didn't fit the costume. She wasn't theatrical. She was strategic. She didn't duel for honor. She negotiated for power. She didn't die in a hail of bullets. She out-talked, outmaneuvered, and outlasted everyone. For many chroniclers, that wasn't swashbuckling. It was just inconvenient. But legends have a way of resurfacing, no matter how hard you try to bury them. In recent years, scholars and history buffs, especially women and those tired of the same old European reruns, have started to reclaim her story. Documentaries, books, even video games are finally acknowledging the queen who ruled the South China Sea. Still, so much about her is obscured by the fog of time. We don't even know her real name. Most of what survives comes filtered through the pens of her enemies, imperial officials, foreign sailors, and Western writers who couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. Yet even through the distortion, you can see the shape of a titan. Jung Yi-sao didn't just break the mold. She never even acknowledged it. She didn't need the world's permission. She took power, wielded it with surgical precision, and then disappeared, richer, more respected, and more dignified than any pirate, male or female, before or since. She wasn't quietly forgotten. She was actively erased. But you know how it goes. Legends always find their way back. Jung Yi-sao didn't need a crown. Her authority came from command, from respect, from the roar of thousands of voices following her orders across the waves. She was, in every sense, a queen, a monarch of a floating realm with no borders but the horizon and no capital but the shifting tides. Her domain stretched from the Gulf of Tonkin to the shores of Guangdong. She built a pirate confederation that was practically a nation, organized, political, functioning, and strong enough to make the Qing Empire sweat. Her ships weren't ragtag raiders. They were disciplined fleets. Her captains weren't loose cannons. They were trusted officers. Her people weren't just outlaws. They were citizens of a floating state, governed by her own strict code. She controlled trade routes, negotiated treaties, and brought order to an ocean that even the Empire couldn't tame. But here's the real magic: her exit. Most pirate stories end in a hail of bullets, a noose, or a tragic last stand. Jung Yi-sao's ends with a negotiated truce, a comfortable retirement, and a pile of silver. She didn't go down with her ship. She stepped off it, perfectly intact, purse strings firmly in hand. By the time she died in 1844, she had accomplished what no pirate, emperor, or general ever managed. She walked away from absolute power, not because she had to, but because she chose to. Her legend wasn't broken by defeat. It was made immortal by survival. Today, there aren't many statues or monuments. No grand palace, no bronze likeness in the square. But her presence lingers, a shadow on the South China Sea, a whisper in every sailor's tale, a spark in the heart of anyone who's ever been told to stay in their place. Jung Yi-sao proved that greatness doesn't need permission, that in a world determined to silence women, one bold voice, sharp, brilliant, and utterly unstoppable, can command an empire. She ruled unapologetically. She fought without hesitation. And she retired undefeated. Not a myth, not a legend, but a woman who conquered the sea and walked away before it could claim her. Her sails may be gone, but her shadow, oh, her shadow, still stretches across the waves, as wide and untouchable as the horizon itself.